On a farm, in a barn, feeling lonely, but I got some yarn. Ooh, yeah, got the yarn.
Another question I've had is, when did I start knitting? How long have I been knitting? I've been knitting since 2013. I did learn when I was younger. Yes, I was 11. My mom taught me how to knit, and I started with acrylic yarn, and it was all her scraps that had been wound really tight, so it was like stretched out. It had no give, and so each strand was like a different width. Some were bouncier than others, and I just started knitting this blanket that just went all over the place, because when I turned, I would do 2 stitches in the first stitch instead of 1 because of how the yarn went over, and you know how that goes. And knitting wasn't really my jam. My very first project bag that I had to carry to house this blanket in was a dress that my mom used to wear, and it was purple with white flowers. It was like a lavendery, mauvey kind of purple with little white flowers all over it. And it wore out, so she took it to pieces and gave me the fabric from the skirt. And I ended up folding that over, and I sewed it together with a needle and dental floss. And because I needed a bag, we were going to town that's about an hour away from where I was born, and I needed somewhere to house this knitting project that I had. And so I sewed this bag together, and the stitches were like this far apart. I did it as fast as I could, and I didn't have thread, so I used dental floss, and I was like, that'll be good enough. And so so I had this big bag for my project, and this is the day I stopped knitting, actually. And I know it's the day I stopped knitting because something really crazy happened that day. We were in a massive, massive car accident. Everybody was okay. That was the day I stopped knitting. I was feeling a little bit superstitious, and so I stopped knitting totally. Fast forward to I was about 16, and one of my mom's friends was crocheting a blanket, and I was very interested in what she was doing. And my mom had this giant granny square blanket, and she had tried to teach me how to crochet many, many, many times, and it just didn't stick. And then I took one of her crocheted blankets, I went to the center, and I just kind of opened up the stitches to see how they went together and to see how they joined and what that looked like. And so I figured out how the stitches were made, and once I figured out how the stitches were made, then I could do it. So I learned how to crochet by taking a blanket and opening up the stitches. I didn't cut it or anything. I just moved them around to see how they were looped and how they attached, and then I got it. After that, I just could not be stopped. I made tons and tons of blankets, and then and I tried to crochet a skirt. I think that was one of my first projects that I never finished, and I ended up ripping it out. I made little pillows for my bed. I read a lot of Anna Green Gables, so it was very that kind of inspired look and feel to it. And then when I started having kids, then I started crocheting things for them to wear, and still had not learned a pattern, still had not looked at a pattern. And I looked at a knitted sweater that one of our girls had been given as a gift, and I loved it. And I was like, I can't knit that, but I can crochet it. So I used it as my formula, and I took measurements, and I measured their little bodies, and I measured how many stitches I was getting. I understood the math before I had not even looked at a pattern at this point. And I made these cute little sweaters, and I'll show you one that I made. So this is a larger version of the first sweater I ever made for my girls, and it is crocheted completely in cotton, like the big bulky cotton that you can get at like Walmart. So that's what it's crocheted with. So this is that's the little ribbing and the sleeves and the button band, and I picked up stitches. And so I had not, at this point, still had not read a pattern. Then I picked up knitting needles and I was doing crocheted hats, and then I did some knitted hats, and somebody wanted an intarsia knitted hat, and I had no idea. So I counted how many stitches I would have, and then I made this chart and I tried to knit it, and there's big gaping holes and it was horrible. And I knit that hat 7 times to try to get it right. I ended up knitting, because she wanted a Spider-Man hat, so I ended up knitting a straight red hat, and then I top stitched in the big eyes, and then I top stitched in what looked like spider web coming from the back to the front. And it took me so long to knit those, and I was like, there needs to be a quicker way of doing this. And I knit a big, like, bulky sweater out of this bulky acrylic yarn for kids. So it's just like this big boxy square thing. So I just did the pieces and then I sewed them all together, and like, just not even, well, it's just like whip stitched together. And then I went into a yarn store, and the yarn store was in Tofino, and this was in 2013. Went into a yarn store in Tofino, and they had all of the yarns, and I could not understand why somebody would pay $20 for a skein of yarn. I was like, no, 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 no. So I found their cheapest yarn that they had in there. It was $10 for this like chunky ball, and it was still acrylic, and it was like rainbow colors. So then I think I knit a hat. It was either knit or crochet, I can't remember. I gave it away as a gift. But it was crochet. And I know this because it took me like 45 minutes to cross the border from Canada into the US. And so while we were waiting at the border crossing, I crocheted this hat. Then I read a pattern for some shoes, some crocheted shoes. So that was my first crochet pattern to actually follow, I think. I went to Prince Edward Island with my husband, and we went to some wool shops, and I picked up some wooden knitting needles and like DPNs and some sock weight yarn. And we got back to the hotel, and I tried to make a ball with this sock weight yarn, and I made a massive mess. Like, it was, I had never touched a skein before, and it was this big knotted mess that took hours to fix. And I started knitting, and it ended up being like huge because I didn't know what to do. I just knew you do ribbing and then you do tube. And so I did ribbing and I did a tube on this one, and it was just huge. So I ended up ripping that out, and then I went on a trip to Mexico, and I brought worsted weight, 100% worsted weight yarn. And again, I knew, you know, you knit a tube and then do something for a heel. Still no idea. So I had these old like clover DPNs that were my mom's, and I was just knitting in a tube, and on the way down to Mexico, no problem. On the way back, they confiscated my knitting needles, so I pulled them out of my knitting. All my stitches were live, and I handed them to them, and they threw them right in the garbage. So they weren't expensive needles, but it was still an interesting lesson for me. So my mom and dad moved it down here, and I did care for my mom before she passed away, and we would sit and I would crochet and she would knit in the same, like on the couch, and she would, you know, she would get really tired and she would just fall asleep mid-stitch and stuff, and we would just spend time together doing that, and we just had this crafty time together. After Mexico, I just started getting really hooked, and I saw these socks in a yarn store that had like multiple colors, And I was totally intrigued by this. The yarn size, the shape, everything about it, I just fell in love with. I took my girls on a trip in 2013, and it was a camping trip. We stopped at a yarn store, and that is where I bought my first sock weight yarn, and it was Drops Fable, or my second sock weight yarn, because I bought some in Prince Edward Island, but bought Drops Fable. And I also got a book on how to knit socks. And so we were camping, and I was learning how to knit socks. The kids were playing and having fun, and I just sat there and I just kept trying, and I was doing toe-up socks. And this was my first knitting pattern to ever follow. Doing toe-up socks, and I had to rip the toe out probably 5 times at least because I kept making it too big, but I was going to get this. So by the time we left from our camping trip, we were at one location for 3 days, and that's where I learned how to knit socks. And I had passed the heel by the time we left. So that was amazing, and that opened up the door for me to knit socks. And then after that, I knit a sweater, and that was the next pattern that I read, and it was I think it's called Enfamili. It is a colorwork sweater, and I knit it for my girls. So I took this pattern and I measured their size, and then I adjusted the pattern and took out enough pattern repeats to shrink it down so it would fit their bodies. And so that was the second pattern that I actually read, was this sweater, colorwork sweater pattern, because I would if I wanted something, I would just figure out how to reinvent the wheel essentially each time. And so it just came really naturally for me to slide into designing as well, because I was doing that before I was following a pattern. So following patterns just became this, it's always educational. Okay, I like what they did there. Okay, I don't understand why they're doing this. And then I'm like, trust the pattern, and I do it, and I'm like, aha, like so many aha moments. And then taking classes, and I also realized that there had to be a way that I could knit, because I knit throwing, and I would let go of my yarn or my needle, and I would grab the yarn, and then I'd go around, and then I'd do my stitch, and then I'd put it in, and I'd let go, and I'd grab the yarn, and it just took a really long time. So this was before the learning to knit a sweater. I looked up fast knitting, and so continental style came up, and so then I just practiced knitting continental style, and I knit hats. And this was before knitting the sweaters. So I already knew how to knit continental style by the time I got to the sweaters. But I just knit hat after hat after hat after hat till my gauge got even, and until I was quick, because I was like, I need to make less movement because my wrist couldn't handle big movements. So doing continental style really saved my hands from this motion. Like everything was over exaggerated. So like continental style is just like, and socks, right? You don't move your hands very much with socks. So it was just like, so that's kind of my knitting journey, and now here we are. 2013 was really the beginning of the sock knitting, or the knitting adventure for me. And so I have been knitting and it was 2013 in the summer is when I really got into it. So 4 years I have been knitting and been a knitter. And then after my mom passed away, I was still sitting on the couch doing my knitting, but I was by myself, and so I didn't have somebody sitting there with me. I didn't know very many people in the crafting community at that point. I had little kids, so I couldn't like leave and go to a knit group. That wasn't an option. And so I went on YouTube, and the thought hit me that there's if I'm interested in it, somebody else is interested in it. So I started looking up knitting, people knitting on YouTube, and so I watched a lot of tutorials so that I wouldn't be by myself knitting. And then I found, I think Two Tangled Skeins was the first podcast I ever found, and the Knit Girls. So the Knit Girls with 3 L's. So I watched Two Tangled Skeins, and I found one of their newer ones, and then I went back and I watched all of their previous ones, and I didn't subscribe to a podcast for at least a year because I didn't have an account. And so I just would look them up every single time, and I went to their very first one and I watched them all the way through. And same with the Knit Girls. I went to the very beginning and I watched, and they were probably 180 episodes in or something at that point, and maybe less, 140, something like that. They were in the hundreds though. So I would just put it on in the morning, and they would be there all day. I would be cycling through all of their videos all day long until it was evening, and I had to do all of the evening stuff. But I would sit and I would knit, and I would do my housework, and there was always a knitter with me while I was doing this whole process. So it was really good, and I enjoyed it very, very much. And I thought, in the beginning, I thought, wouldn't it be nice to start a podcast? And then I was like, well, maybe not. Like, there's enough people doing it, and there was a lot of new podcasts coming out at that point. And then I watched a podcast that I just watched one episode of a podcast, and they were talking about people starting podcasts. And it just gave me the push I felt I needed to do a podcast. So I did. And I like to challenge myself. So that was a challenge for me, doing an actual podcast, and meeting all of the wonderful knitters that are out there, and just learning to knit faster. So that is my knitting journey, and here we are, and thank you so much for joining me. And that's all I have for today, so I will see you tomorrow.
Who got the yarn? I'm gonna do some knitting. Knit, 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 knit. I need to do some knitting.